The sun was slipping low behind the ridgeline, dragging the long shadows of cottonwoods across the valley floor. Evening came quickly in that part of the country. One moment the world glowed gold, the next it sank into bruised shades of purple. Dust clung to the air, stirred by the slow plodding of a single horse making its way along the narrow dirt track. The rancher sat tall in the saddle, though his back ached from the long day. His hands were darkened by sun and years of labor, resting loosely on the reins as his horse walked the familiar road toward home. He wasn't a man of many words, nor a man who sought company. He had the quiet kind of face that made people lower their voices around him, a face carved by wind, grief, and a life spent beneath an unrelenting sky. The ranch lay another hour's ride ahead. He was thinking of little more than a hot meal, and the silence of his porch when something on the roadside caught his eye. Two figures, small and still, half hidden in the tall grass. At first he thought it was a pair of stray calves maybe, or dogs, until one of them moved, and he saw a thin arm lift against the dimming light. Children got the horse slowed at his silent command, hooves crunching on the gravel. The figures became clearer. Two girls, standing close together, clutching one another as though the world itself meant to swallow them whole. Dust streaked their dresses. Their shoes were caked with mud. The younger, perhaps no more than 6, held a ragged doll, by its arm, its stuffing peeking from a split seam. The older girl had her jaw set tight, but her wide eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to hide. The rancher reined in his horse a few feet away. Neither child moved. For a long breath, only the creak of leather and the soft huff of the horse filled the air. "What are you doing out here?" His voice was gravelly, unused to conversation. The older girl stepped forward, just enough to shield her sister. She swallowed hard before answering. "We're waiting." "For who?" Her lips pressed together. She looked down at the ground, scuffing it with the tip of her worn shoe. The rancher's gaze shifted between them, noting the hollowness in their cheeks, the dirt caked under their fingernails, the way the little one leaned heavy against her sister, as if her legs were too tired to keep standing. He might have ridden on. After all, these weren't his children, and a man who worked. The land knew better than to take on troubles that weren't his own. But something about the stillness of the two girls in the fading light, the way they clung together like shipwreck survivors, made him linger. Then the older one spoke again, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Can you take her instead of me?" The words hung in the air, strange and heavy. For a moment the rancher thought he'd misheard. He shifted slightly in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "Take who?" She pointed, her hand trembling, toward her little sister. "Her, please. Take her with you." The younger girl blinked up at the rancher with solemn eyes, too tired or too confused to speak. Her doll dangled limply at her side. The rancher said nothing. His face remained unreadable, but inside something turned over something he had kept buried for years. He looked down at these two fragile figures, standing in the middle of nowhere as night crept in, and realized they had no one else. The silence stretched long enough for the older girl to fidget, wringing her hands, her shoulders squaring as if preparing for rejection. He saw it then. She wasn't just asking out of desperation. She was offering herself up as expendable, bargaining her own absence so her sister might have a chance at warmth, at safety, at anything better than the dark road behind them. A coyote called far off in the hills, thin and mournful. The little one startled at the sound and pressed herself tighter against her sister's side. The rancher exhaled slowly. He shifted in the saddle, his boots brushing the stirrups, but he didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he studied the horizon, where the last thread of daylight was unraveling, and weighed the weight of the choice before him. The silence after the girl's question seemed to stretch forever. The rancher, still astride his horse, looked down at her as though trying to read words that had been carved into stone and weathered by years of storms. She stood there, chin trembling though she held it high, waiting for his judgment. "Can you take her instead of me?" It was not the kind of question a child should know how to ask. It wasn't a game or some childish fancy. It was the sound of someone already accustomed to loss, someone who had rehearsed the act of giving up everything, just to keep another safe. The rancher rubbed his jaw with a roughened hand, feeling the coarse stubble rasp against his palm. His horse shifted beneath him, ears flicking at the scent of dusk. "What do you mean by that?" His tone was steady, but the weight of the question pressed on his chest. The girl pressed her lips together before answering. She can't walk much farther. She hasn't eaten all day. You can take her, right? Just her. I'll be fine." The younger sister's head tilted, confusion clouding her wide brown eyes. She clutched her doll tighter, not understanding the sacrifice being offered on her behalf. The rancher's brow furrowed. He had seen many strange things on lonely roads, but this, two children abandoned, one begging to be left behind, this tore something loose inside him. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on gravel. The ground felt heavier than usual as he closed the space between them. "How old are you, girl?" he asked. 10. She squared her shoulders, almost defiantly. "I can take care of myself." "You think so?" "Yes." Her chin lifted, though her eyes darted toward the darkening road, betraying her fear. The rancher crouched slightly, bringing his weathered face level with hers. Up close he could see the dust smudged across her cheeks, the faint red mark on her arm where her sister's small fingers clung. She was trying hard to look older, stronger, but she was still just a child who had been asked to bear too much. "Why not both of you?" he asked at last, his voice low. Her lips trembled, and for a moment the tough facade cracked. "Because it's easier that way." She blinked quickly, fighting tears. "I can walk. I can sleep outside. I know how. But she cries when she's cold. She gets sick. She needs someone. She can't do it alone." The words came fast now, spilling from her like water bursting from a dam. "I promised Mama I'd look after her. She told me that when she—" Her voice faltered, catching on something she didn't want to say aloud. "When she had to go." The rancher didn't press her. He'd heard enough to stitch together the picture. A mother gone, whether by sickness, death, or some other misfortune, and a father nowhere in sight. Two girls left to the mercy of the road. The older sister's small fists balled at her sides, her body trembling with the strain of standing her ground. She was terrified, but she wasn't backing down. She would trade her own safety for her sister's without hesitation. The rancher let out a long breath, his eyes softening in a way they hadn't in years. The girl's plea stirred echoes in him, echoes of another voice, long silenced, that had once begged him to protect what could not be replaced. He had failed then. He would not fail now. But he didn't say any of this. He was not a man who dealt in long speeches or promises. Instead, he simply reached for the smaller girl, lifting her gently into his arms. She went without protest, resting her head against his shoulder, too weary to resist. The doll dangled from her limp hand, brushing against his vest. The older sister's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she thought he meant to leave her behind after all, that he had taken her words literally. She took a step forward, panic flashing in her gaze. But the rancher turned, walked to his horse, and with a practiced motion settled the little one onto the saddle. Then he extended a calloused hand toward the older sister. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Both," he said simply. The word landed with the weight of a promise. No sermon, no explanation, just a single word that cut through the despair like a lantern in the dark. The girl's throat worked as she swallowed hard, fighting against the sudden rush of relief that threatened to undo her. She placed her hand in his, small and trembling, and for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she allowed herself to believe they might not be alone anymore. The older girl's hand lingered in his, small and trembling against the rough calluses of a man who had built his life on hard work and harder loss. For a moment, she searched his face as if waiting for some spoken assurance that wouldn't come, but the rancher said nothing. Silence had been his language for years. Silence when neighbors invited him to supper. Silence when the church bell rang on Sundays and pews filled without him. Silence even when the memories clawed at him in the dead of night, memories of another child's laughter that had long since been buried beneath the prairie grass. Words, he had decided long ago, were fragile things. Too often they were broken. Too often they were false, so he held his tongue. Even now, the older girl climbed into the saddle behind her sister, wrapping her thin arms protectively around the smaller body. The horse shifted beneath their combined weight, but the rancher steadied it with a gentle hand on the reins. He checked their balance, adjusted the stirrup leather so her small boot wouldn't slip through, and only then swung back into the saddle. The children were pressed against him now, their warmth unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The younger one's head lolled against his chest, already drifting into sleep. The older remained stiff, every muscle taut, as though she expected the world to snatch her sister away at any moment. The road stretched out before them, a ribbon of gray fading into the deepening dusk. Coyotes yipped faintly in the distance, their cries swallowed by the wide silence of the land. The rancher urged the horse forward at a slow, steady pace. Still, he said nothing. The girl waited. She tilted her head up, searching for answers in his weathered profile. Why wasn't he asking where they came from? Why wasn't he promising to take them somewhere safe? Why wasn't he telling her what would happen next? The quiet unnerved her. It was too much like the silence that followed her father's departure, too much like the silence when her mother stopped waking up in the mornings. Finally, she whispered, "You're not going to say anything?" The rancher glanced down at her, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He held her gaze for a moment, then returned his eyes to the road. She frowned, chewing at her bottom lip. "You're just gonna take us? Like that?" His jaw tightened, but he gave no reply. The girl's frustration grew. What if you change your mind? What if you decide you don't want us anymore?" Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fears she had been fighting so fiercely to bury. Still, the rancher kept his silence. He guided the horse around a bend in the road, the moonlight now brushing faint silver over the valley. The girl pressed her face against her sister's hair, blinking back tears. She told herself she had to be strong, had to keep believing she could protect her, but inside, doubt gnawed at her. For all she knew, this stranger might be no better than the man who had left them behind. But then, without words, the rancher did something that spoke louder than any promise. As the horse walked on, he shifted his weight carefully, one arm slipping behind the girl's, steadying them against the saddle. It was not a grand gesture, just a small, instinctive one, yet it carried the quiet assurance that he would not let them fall. The older girl froze, startled by the touch. Then slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to lean back against him. The weight of his arm felt solid, immovable, like the trunk of an old oak tree that had weathered storms and still stood tall. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to hold the world together on her own. The rancher's silence was not the same as absence. She realized that now. His silence was weighty, deliberate, like the silence of the land. It's self-enduring, watchful, steadfast. The miles slipped by in wordless companionship. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the endless black dome of the sky. The horse's steady gait lulled the younger sister deeper into sleep. Her tiny breaths even and soft. At last, the older girl whispered, so faintly she wasn't sure he even heard, "Thank you." The rancher didn't answer, but the faintest nod of his head beneath the brim of his hat told her enough, and so they rode on, two children and a man who had no words left to give, but who carried them forward anyway, as if silence itself could be a kind of vow. The ranch house lights glimmered faintly in the distance by the time the horse crested the ridge. It wasn't much, just a lantern burning in the kitchen window, but to the two girls, it looked like the beacon of another world. Warmth, shelter, a place that didn't vanish when the night grew cold. The older sister kept her eyes fixed on it, even as her thoughts spun in a storm of doubt. She hadn't meant to tell this stranger anything. The less people knew, the safer she felt. But with every hoofbeat, the silence between them grew heavier, pressing on her chest until she couldn't bear it. She cleared her throat. "We were waiting for Pa." The words slipped out so suddenly that she startled herself. The rancher gave no reply, but his head angled slightly, listening. "He said he was going to town to get work." Her voice faltered on the word work. "Said he'd be back in a week. It's been 3. The horse snorted, breath clouding in the cool air. The older girl's arms tightened around her sister, who was still asleep, clinging to her ragged doll. "He left us some bread," she went on. "Not much. We stretched it best we could, but—" she shook her head. "Then Mama," her throat caught. For a long moment, she couldn't finish. The rancher said nothing, waiting. "She took sick," the girl whispered at last. "She said it was just a fever, but she kept getting weaker. And one morning she—" The girl's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to cry. She didn't wake up. Her words fell into the dark like stones into a well. The rancher's jaw clenched. He kept his gaze forward, but inside, something deep shifted. He knew sickness. He knew the look of someone slipping away, no matter how fiercely they promised to stay. He had buried enough to understand. The girl pressed her face against her sister's hair, speaking softer now, as if to herself. "I buried her by the creek. Put stones on top so the coyotes wouldn't get her. Didn't know if I did it right, but—" She blinked hard, biting back tears. "I had to try." The rancher's throat tightened. He had dug such graves himself, hard, lonely work in unyielding earth. No child should ever have to take up that task. She sniffed, angry at her own weakness. "Then I thought maybe Pei would come back, so we waited. Every day, we waited. But he never came." Her voice grew sharper, edged with something harder than grief. "I think he's not coming back at all. Maybe he never meant to." The words hung between them, bitter and raw. She was too young to speak them, yet old enough now to understand abandonment. The rancher remained silent, but his hand tightened slightly on the reins. He knew the kind of men who promised much and delivered nothing. He'd seen it before, fathers who walked away when the weight grew heavy, men who left others to clean up the wreckage of their cowardice. The girl's small shoulders trembled. She tried to steady herself, but the dam broke. "I tried," she whispered fiercely, as though confessing. "I tried to take care of her. I kept her warm, I gave her my food when there wasn't enough. I told her stories so she wouldn't cry. But it's hard. It's so hard." Her tears finally slipped free, hot against the night air. The rancher didn't speak. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He'd never been a man to make promises he couldn't guarantee. But his silence carried something different this time. Not indifference, but presence. The solid, wordless weight of someone who was listening. Girl sensed it. Her sobs softened, her words trailing into whispers. "I don't know what we're supposed to do now." The horse carried them onward, hooves steady against the dirt road. The rancher's arm remained firm behind them, keeping both girls secure in the saddle. He didn't need to answer. The answer was already in the act itself. He was taking them forward, away from the emptiness of the road behind them, toward the faint light ahead. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the older sister let herself lean into that silence. It was not abandonment this time, it was shelter. And though she would never forget the promises that had been broken, she began just faintly to believe in the ones that didn't need words at all. The horse slowed as they neared the ranch. The lantern in the kitchen window burned brighter now, throwing a warm halo against the clapboard walls. The barn loomed nearby, dark and familiar, its roofline cutting a sharp silhouette against the hubs. The barn loomed nearby, dark and familiar. Star-salted sky. The rancher felt the girls stir behind him, the older tense, the younger still heavy with sleep. He dismounted with practiced ease, boots crunching on gravel, then reached up to lift them down one at a time. The little one whimpered softly but didn't wake, curling instinctively against his chest when he carried her. The older followed, reluctant to release her grip on her sister until her feet touched solid ground. They stood there a moment in the yard, two small figures blinking up at the house. The girl's face was wary, braced for whatever came next. "Is this your place?" she asked finally. The rancher gave a single nod. His hand rested against the doorframe, the weight of a choice pressing heavier than the day's labor ever had. For years, his life had been stripped down to bare bones. One man, one horse, a stretch of land that neither comforted nor betrayed him. He had built walls not just around the house, but around himself, walls meant to keep grief out, though really they had only kept him in. Now, standing in the yard with two children who had nowhere else to go, those walls felt suddenly fragile. Older girl seemed to sense his hesitation. She pulled her sister's ragged doll tighter against her chest, her voice small but steady. "You don't have to keep us. We can sleep in the barn. We won't cause trouble." The rancher's jaw tightened. He looked down at her, this slip of a child who had learned too young how to bargain for scraps of safety. She expected rejection. She had rehearsed it in her head, preparing to be turned away like a stray dog scratching at a back door. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped past her and shouldered the door open. The hinges groaned, spilling the warm glow of lamplight across the worn wooden floor. He carried the little one inside and laid her gently on the narrow settee by the hearth. She curled, instinctively, her small hands clutching the threadbare cushion. The older girl lingered in the doorway, torn between hope and mistrust. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, ready to bolt if he sent her away. The rancher turned back. His gaze met hers, steady, unreadable, but not unkind. He held it long enough for her to understand, then motioned with a tilt of his head toward the hearth. "Both," he said again, his gravel-deep voice carrying more weight than a speech could have done. It was the decision spoken in a single word. No conditions, no bargains. The girl's breath caught. Relief crashed over her so suddenly it made her dizzy. She stepped inside, hesitant at first, then hurried to her sister's side. She smoothed the younger one's hair, tucking the doll close, her trembling hands betraying just how much the moment meant. The rancher hung his hat on the wall peg, the gesture final, as if closing a door on his old solitary life. He stoked the fire until it roared brighter, filling the room with heat. The shadows retreated, leaving the girls in a pool of light that softened the lines of their tired faces. For the first time in years, the house did not feel empty. The girl looked up from her sister, her voice tentative. "Why?" The rancher paused, poker in hand. He didn't answer right away. Words were not his strength, and the truth that he saw in them the ghosts of what he had lost was not something he could hand over easily. So he set the poker aside, straightened, and met her gaze. His silence carried the weight of an oath. Because no child should be left behind. Because family should never be split apart. Because I will not fail this time. But all he said aloud was, "Get some rest." The girl nodded slowly, eyes glistening. For once she didn't argue. She curled beside her sister on the settee, exhaustion dragging her into sleep. The rancher watched them for a long while, the fire crackling softly. The decision was made. Whatever storms came next, he had chosen. And as the flames lit the room, the silence in the house shifted from hollow to full. From empty to waiting. The next morning came with the sound of roosters crowing from the barn and sunlight spilling across the ranch house floorboards. The little one stirred first, blinking sleepily in the warm glow of the fire that had burned low through the night. She stretched, hugged her doll, and when she realized she was lying on a cushioned seat instead of the cold ground, a tiny smile tugged at her lips. But the older sister woke differently. The moment her eyes opened, she sat upright, tense, scanning the room. Her first thought was not of comfort, but of danger. Where are we? What does he want from us? Her second thought was of her sister. Is she safe? Only after confirming the younger girl was still curled beside her, breathing peacefully, did she exhale. The rancher was already at the stove, frying bacon in an old cast-iron skillet. He moved quietly, as though not to startle them, but his presence filled the room nonetheless. He glanced over once, gave a small nod, then returned to his work. The little one giggled when the scent of bacon reached her nose. "Smells good," she whispered. The older girl hushed her quickly. "Don't say nothing yet," she warned under her breath, her eyes narrowing on the man at the stove. "We don't know if he's keeping us." When the rancher set 2 plates on the table, the younger skipped over eagerly. The older hesitated, standing rooted by the hearth. She studied the food-thick slices of bacon, scrambled eggs, a heel of cornbread, and suspicion coiled in her belly. Nothing came free in her experience. "Eat," the rancher said simply, pulling out a chair. The younger girl obeyed, climbing onto the seat and digging in with all the hunger of a child who hadn't had a proper meal in days. The older remained by the fire, arms folded tight across her chest. "What do you want for it?" she asked finally, her voice sharp. The rancher paused mid-bite, raising his head slowly. His weathered eyes settled on her, steady but unreadable. "For what?" "For feeding us." Silence stretched. Then quietly, "Nothin'." She didn't believe him. Nothing in her short life had come without cost. When neighbors gave hand-me-down dresses, they expected chores in return. When Pei left bread, he expected silence about where he disappeared. Even her mother's love had been tangled with requests whispered in fever, "Look after your sister, promise me." So she stood stiff and wary, hunger gnawing but pride refusing to bend. The rancher didn't push. He simply left the plate where it was, turning back to his own meal. He ate without fuss, as if her refusal meant nothing at all. That almost unnerved her more. Eventually, her stomach betrayed her, growling loud enough for even her sister to giggle. The rancher said nothing, didn't even glance her way. But when she crept to the table and slid into the chair, he slid the plate closer without a word. She ate cautiously at first, as though each bite might vanish, then faster once she realized the food wasn't going anywhere. She still kept glancing sideways at him, waiting for the moment he'd demand repayment. It never came. Days fell into rhythm after that. The rancher gave them small tasks: collecting eggs, scattering feed, fetching water. He didn't bark orders or watch them like a hawk. He just worked alongside them, steady and silent, showing more by action than instruction. The younger girl took to it quickly, delighting in the chickens and giggling when the ponies nuzzled her hand. But the older kept her guard up. When the rancher praised her sister's efforts with a rare smile, she tensed, suspicious of kindness. When he offered her the smaller of 2 blankets one night, she shook her head sharply. "She needs it more," He didn't argue. He draped it over them both after she had fallen asleep anyway. Trust was not something the older girl could give easily. She watched him always, eyes sharp, measuring his every movement. At night she whispered to her sister, "Don't get too used to this. He might change his mind." But slowly, in ways she didn't want to admit, her vigilance began to falter. She noticed the way he always kept the lantern burning until they were safe inside. The way he placed his body between them and the road when strangers passed by. The way he rose before dawn to see the work done, never asking them to do more than their share. Each act was small, ordinary, but together they built a pattern. And patterns, she realized reluctantly, were harder to fake. Still, she wasn't ready to let go of control. She had carried her sister through hunger, through sickness, through death. To set that burden down to trust someone else to hold it felt almost like betrayal. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the rancher set a small saddle on a pony and gestured to her. "Your turn," he said. She bristled. "I need to watch her. She's watching herself just fine." He tilted his chin toward the younger, already giggling as she stroked the pony's mane. The older girl's jaw tightened. Her instinct screamed to resist, to let someone else teach. Her sister to let someone else carry the weight was dangerous. Yet the steady look in the rancher's eyes unnerved her, not demanding, not impatient, simply certain. Slowly, reluctantly, she placed her foot in the stirrup. It was not surrender, not yet. But it was the first step toward believing that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything alone. The ranch was not a grand place. It was simple, weather-worn, built more for endurance than for beauty. Fences sagged in places. The barn roof bore patches of tin hammered on by the rancher's own hand, and the porch creaked when anyone walked across it. But to the two girls, it was more than walls and timber. It was steady. It was here each morning when they woke and each night when they closed their eyes. The younger sister adapted first. Children that age bend easily like young branches in the wind. She grew attached to the chickens, giving each one names: Daisy, Clover, Buttercup. The rancher said nothing about her chatter, but he listened as she trailed after him, telling him which hen was the prettiest or which rooster was the meanest bully. The older sister, meanwhile, hovered near her sibling like a watchful hawk. She followed her into the barn, stood guard by the chicken coop, and counted every step the rancher took in their direction. Yet even her sharp eyes began to soften as days turned into weeks. She noticed how he always let her sister scatter the feed first, standing back patiently even when the little girl's small fists tossed more grain onto her shoes than into the coop. She noticed how he lifted her into the saddle of the gentlest pony, walking beside her instead of riding off, his long hand steady on the reins. It was routine that began to thaw her, the rhythm of chores, the predictability of meals, the certainty that the roof wouldn't vanish in the night. Mornings began with the sound of the windmill creaking as the rancher drew water. The girls learned to haul buckets with both hands, wobbling under the weight, their laughter echoing across the yard when they splashed themselves more than the trough. Afternoons were for mending shirts patched, socks darned with thread the rancher kept in an old tobacco tin. Evenings brought supper around the wooden table: beans, cornbread, sometimes meat if the hunt had gone well. The younger sister began humming as she worked, filling the house with little tunes that had no words. The older still kept her watchfulness, but even she found her shoulders loosening when the chores were done and the three of them sat by the fire in companionable quiet. The rancher, for his part, remained much the same quiet, steady, saying little, but the silence was no longer empty. It held the scrape of spoons against bowls, the soft thump of a doll being tucked under a quilt, the sound of children's laughter drifting through the rafters. One evening, after a day spent fixing fence posts, The rancher brought out a battered harmonica. He didn't announce it or ask for attention. He simply sat on the porch steps as the sky bled orange and pressed it to his lips. A low, mournful tune drifted into the air, carrying over the fields like smoke. The younger girl sat cross-legged, at his feet transfixed. The older lingered by the porch rail, arms crossed but ears tuned, her expression caught between curiosity and suspicion. When the song ended, the little one clapped. "Play another." The rancher's lips twitched almost a smile as he obliged Dot. It became a ritual after that. The harmonica at dusk, the little one clapping along, the older girl listening, though she never admitted how much it soothed her. Seasons shifted. The grass grew tall, then dry and golden. The air cooled, carrying the scent of harvest. With each passing day, the girl's presence threaded deeper into the fabric of the ranch. The younger learned to carry eggs without breaking them. The older learned to swing a hammer, her small hands gripping the handle with determination as she drove nails into loose boards. One afternoon, while the rancher was repairing tack, he heard giggling from the barn. He found the sisters attempting to brush one of the ponies, their strokes uneven but earnest. The pony, patient as stone, stood chewing hay while they argued over who was doing it right. He didn't interrupt. He simply leaned against the stall door and watched, the corner of his mouth softening as though the sight itself stitched something inside him back together. Life on the ranch was not easy, but it was steady. For the girls, steady was enough. For the rancher, steady was something he hadn't known in years. And though no one said it aloud, not the rancher with his silence, not the older sister with her guarded eyes, it was becoming clear with each passing day, the house that had once echoed with emptiness was beginning to sound like a home again. The girls had been at the ranch nearly a month when the older one finally asked what had been on her mind since that first night. Why? She didn't ask it outright. Not yet. It slipped out sideways, hidden inside smaller questions. Why don't you go to town much? Why don't you have anybody else living here? Why do you keep that bedroom shut? Each time, the rancher gave no answer. Sometimes he lifted a brow. Sometimes he just kept working. His silence was not cruel, but it was heavy, as if the words he might have spoken were locked away in a place too far for him to reach. The girls noticed the room, most of all the one at the end of the hall with its door closed tight. The younger asked once if it was a closet. The rancher only shook his head. When she pushed for more, the older sister hushed her. She had seen the way his jaw tightened, the shadow that crossed his eyes. It was the older girl who began piecing together the story, though she had little more than fragments to go on. She watched the way he lingered at the edge of the pasture. At dusk, staring off toward the hills long after the chores were done. She saw the way his hands, strong as stone when handling a horse, trembled faintly when they rested on that shut door's knob. And she noticed how his face softened just barely when the younger laughed, as if the sound reminded him of something long gone. One night, unable to sleep, she padded into the kitchen for water. She found him sitting at the table, head bowed, an open locket in his palm. She froze. Inside the locket were two faces, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that looked as though it could light a whole valley, and a small boy with a mop of dark hair, no older than her sister. The rancher didn't move. He didn't seem to notice her at first. The lamplight caught the grooves of his face, deepened by years of sun and sorrow. When he finally looked up, his expression was bare in a way she hadn't seen before, not guarded, not stern, but raw. Girl's throat tightened. She whispered, "They were yours, weren't they?" The rancher's gaze held hers. He didn't answer in words. He only closed the locket gently, set it back on the table, and rubbed a hand over his face. The silence said enough. The girl stepped closer, her bare feet soft against the wooden floor. She didn't push him with more questions. Somehow she knew this was not a story that needed telling, but a wound that needed space. Still, he spoke at last, his voice rough, the words dragged from a place he rarely let himself visit. Fever took him, both. The girl swallowed hard. She thought of her mother, of the stones by the creek. She thought of the way she had clutched her sister's hand, promising she wouldn't let go. The rancher's grief was different from hers, older, heavier, but she recognized the shape of it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a single nod, eyes fixed on the locket. "Long time ago, but it don't go away." The girl sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. For once she didn't feel like a child intruding on an adult's world. She felt like someone who understood. They stayed that way for a while, the lantern flickering between them. No more words came, but something shifted in the silence. The girl realized the rancher's quiet wasn't emptiness, it was survival. He had learned to live with grief by folding it into silence, carrying it like a stone in his pocket. And she understood, too, why he had taken them in. Not because they needed him, though they did, but because he needed them, needed the chance to protect what he hadn't been able to keep safe before. When she rose to go back to bed, she hesitated at the doorway. She looked at him once more, the locket glinting in the lamplight, and whispered, "We won't leave." For the first time since they'd come, the rancher's lips twitched into the faintest smile, and though the house still carried its ghosts, it carried new voices, two voices that softened the edges of the past and hinted at the possibility of healing. Autumn deepened, painting the cottonwoods gold along the creek bed. The mornings grew crisp, their breath fogging in the air as the sisters ran across the yard to the barn. Life at the ranch had taken root in them like seeds in fertile soil. The younger one blossomed quickly, but it was the older who changed the most, though she was the last to see it. She still carried her guard like armor, watching the rancher with wary eyes, always bracing for the moment he might decide he'd had enough. But the days stretched into weeks, and each one carried the same rhythm: chores, meals, the steady presence of the man who never raised his voice, never turned them away, never asked for more than they could give. Little by little, her shoulders began to lower. It showed first in small things. When the rancher handed her the water pail, she no longer snatched it as if it might be snatched back. When he taught her how to tie a proper knot, she listened instead of insisting she already knew. When he saddled the pony, she climbed up without arguing that she had to watch her sister. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she realized her hands were empty. For months, maybe years, she had always carried something her sister's hand, a scrap of food, a bundle of blankets. But here, on the ranch, her sister was safe enough to skip across the yard alone, her laughter trailing like music. The realization struck her so sharply she froze in place. She wasn't carrying the burden anymore. The rancher noticed. He had a way of watching without staring, letting her find her own path. That night, after supper, he slid a deck of cards across the table. "You know how to play?" he asked. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, but curiosity outweighed it. She shook her head. He taught her simple games, explaining the rules in as few words as possible, his rough hand shuffling with surprising deftness. The younger sister clapped whenever she won, squealing with delight. The older tried to hide her smile, but when she laid down a winning hand, the corners of her mouth betrayed her. The rancher said nothing, but he caught the spark in her eyes. The spark of a child allowed, at last, to just be a child. It wasn't easy for her. Old habits clung tight. At night, she still checked the door twice, still whispered to her sister, "Stay close." But the whispers grew softer, less frantic. Trust was a muscle, and it was slowly learning how to work again. One afternoon, the rancher sent her with a bucket to fetch water from the creek. She obeyed, muttering about how heavy it was, how far she had to walk. Halfway there, she realized she was complaining out loud something she hadn't done in months. Complaints were luxuries. You didn't whine when survival was at stake. She stopped mid-step, startled by her own voice. The rancher, walking behind her, only gave a faint grunt of amusement. He didn't scold. He didn't remind her how lucky she was. He just let her be 10 years old for once. The turning point came on a stormy night. Wind howled through the eaves, rattling the windows. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the walls. The younger sister whimpered, crawling into her sister's arms. The older tried to soothe her, whispering the same promises she always had. "It's okay. I've got you. Nothing's gonna hurt you." But her own voice trembled. The storm reminded her of nights on the road, of huddling beneath trees with nothing but a thin blanket between them and the sky. Fear seeped through the cracks in her armor. She felt the rancher before she saw him, his shadow filling the doorway, his steps steady across the creaking floor. He didn't say anything. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, a solid presence. Against the storm. When lightning flashed, his outline was there. When thunder roared, his silence steadied the room. For the first time, the older sister loosened her grip on the younger. She let her sister burrow against the rancher's arm instead. And when exhaustion finally pulled her under, she fell asleep not as the protector, but as the protected. The next morning, she woke to find her sister still curled against the rancher's side. The storm passed, the sun rising bright over the hills. She rubbed her eyes, disoriented, then realized something had shifted inside her. For so long she had believed she was the only wall standing between her sister and the world. But now another wall stood firm beside her, stronger, steadier, unmovable. She didn't have to hold it all alone anymore. And for the first time in years, the thought didn't terrify her. It comforted her. Winter crept onto the land with a quiet that felt heavier than the storm. Frost gathered along the window panes. The ground hardened under morning hooves. The girls bundled themselves in wool coats the rancher had dug out of an old trunk, the sleeves rolled up past their wrists. Life slowed, but the rhythm remained. The chores, the suppers, the evenings by the fire. It was one of those evenings. The three of them gathered in the flickering glow when the younger sister asked it again. Her voice was softer this time, almost curious, as though she had only just remembered the night it all began. "Can you take her instead of me?" The words dropped into the quiet like stones into still water. The rancher stilled. The older sister's eyes widened, the memory rushing back with a sharpness that stung. The rancher didn't look at either of them at first. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, then reached for the poker, shifting the logs in the fireplace until sparks rose. The crackle filled the silence, but the question lingered. At last, he turned his gaze to the younger girl, his eyes steady, not unkind. "No," he said simply, her head tilted. "Why not?" His gaze slid to the older sister then, and for a long moment he said nothing. But in that silence, the truth unspooled itself, wordless but clear. The older sister felt it before he spoke. She remembered the locket, the faces inside, the closed room at the end of the hall. She remembered how he had sat through the storm, unmovable, how he had let her finally rest. She remembered the way he looked at them, not as burdens, not as strays, but as something far heavier, far more sacred, because he had already lost once, because he knew the cost of instead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gruff, almost breaking. "I don't take one without the other." The younger frowned, confused. The older blinked hard, her throat tight. The rancher leaned back, resting his weathered hands on his knees. "You came together. You stay together. That's the way it is." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even much of an answer. But it was enough. The younger accepted it easily, as children do, nodding before curling against his side with a yawn. The older, though, sat in silence, her chest aching with something too big for words. She had asked that question once in her heart, too not aloud, but in whispers of fear. Would someone ever take me instead? Would anyone ever keep us both? Now she knew. The fire burned low. The house creaked under the weight of winter wind. And in that quiet room something settled at last, the understanding that they were not guests, not temporary, not charity. They were his. The days that followed didn't change in appearance. There were still fences to mend, animals to feed, firewood to split. But everything felt different, underlined by the weight of that answer. The older sister stopped waiting for the day he might send them away. The younger stopped asking questions that belonged to shadows. And the rancher, though he still spoke little, seemed to carry himself differently too. Lighter, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. The house that had been quiet for too long now rang with laughter, arguments over chores, off-key humming. The ghosts remained, but they no longer had the run of the place. One evening, when the tum-tsin-tum, when the din-din, when the dividino longer had the run of the place. One evening, when the wunger had the run of the place. One evening, when the bidzi kamadavedawana ensim. First snow fell, the girls rushed outside, spinning in the flakes, their boots kicking up powder. The rancher stood on the porch, watching, his breath clouding the air. The older sister glanced back at him once, and for the first time she smiled without hesitation. A smile that said, "I trust you. I belong here." He gave the faintest nod in return. The little one shrieked with joy, scooping snow into her mittened hands. She ran to the rancher, laughing breathlessly. "Come play with us." He shook his head, muttering something about being too old for such foolishness. But when she tugged at his hand and the older girl joined in with a rare grin, he sighed long low, as if giving in to something larger than himself, and stepped down into the snow. The three of them tumbled into the drift. The sound of laughter rising against the silent hills. No one spoke of loss that night. No one spoke of what had been asked on that first desperate evening. But the answer lived in every moment. Unspoken and immovable. He hadn't taken one instead of the other. He had taken them both. And together they had become something new. Not a replacement for what was gone, not a bargain struck in sorrow, but a family, quiet, imperfect, unasked for, yet wholly, undeniably real.